Hi. Let's talk about Man in the Iron Mask.
Musical styles are still a very important form of communication for our young people.
In 1998, Randall Wallace dropped his historically inspired action drama that is Man in the Iron Mask. Now, before I get into the cast or any of the meat of the story, there's something I want to make clear. First and foremost, I specifically said historically inspired for a reason. This movie is set during the French Revolution and has King Louis XIV as one of its main players. Yes, the Musketeers were a real military group and did serve the king and his father before him. And yes, the Man in the Iron Mask was a real prisoner who there are numerous documents about. However, this is where we start to dive into the unknown. First, it was misreported that the man was in fact in an iron mask. The earliest reports say that his face was actually wrapped in some sort of black cloth, so already we're taking some liberties with what actually happened historically. There were multiple theories as to who the person in the mask actually was, and this movie takes one of those theories and runs with it. That it was the current king's twin brother, and that he was sent away really young as to not have anyone else attempt to take the throne and have any sort of power struggle in the country. It's important to me that we have this context because often with films like 300 or The Patriot, for example, history is treated like a buffet where you pick what you want and leave what you don't. But I think it's important to know the distinction of a fun film that is still historically inaccurate. So cool, now that we got that established and I'm done being a buzzkill, we can actually talk about the cast in the movie. Up top, we have Leonardo DiCaprio playing the twins of King Louis and Philippe, respectively, Jeremy Irons as the conflicted musketeer turned priest Aramis, Gabriel Byrne as D'Artagnan, the most devoted and arguably most legendary of the group, Gerard Depardieu as the group's depressed friend Porthos, and John Malkovich as the pretty justified hothead of the group, Athos. Now, most of you will know the majority of the cast from their other work, so I won't bother listing them out here, but Gerard is mainly a French actor and doesn't do too much US work. However, he did star in a TV retelling of Les Mis, and actually that had John Malkovich as well, so it's just a little fun fact there. The director who I mentioned, Randall Wallace, also wrote the screenplays for We Were Soldiers, Braveheart, and Pearl Harbor. So as you can see, he tends to keep to his whole movies are fun but historically inaccurate motif that I mentioned. Now, on the surface, there isn't much to talk about in terms of the story than what I already said up top. Musketeers are trying to use the king's twin brother to replace the king and save the country. And the story is exactly that, plus Athos going on about a son every 10 minutes.
Yes, Raul is my reason, but not in the way you think.
But much like with my Get Him to the Greek episode, where I compared the story to A Christmas Carol, and my Austin Powers episode, where I compared the story to Captain America the First Avenger, this story, when you take a step back, is actually about the stages of grief. So let's go over it. The first of our characters we see on screen is D'Artagnan, who represents denial throughout the story. He spends the majority of the film remaining loyal to King Louis, in part because he feels it's his duty to uphold the oath he swore to the crown, and in part because it turns out that he's actually the twins' father. But he does this despite the overwhelming evidence, both before the movie starts and the events during, that the king has long since lost any honor and has become a pure tyrant. He's told over and over that the king isn't worth serving anymore, but he clings to his ideals and really crosses the line between hope and denial. And he only really comes around because he wants to try to save his other son. I'd argue that if Philippe hadn't been involved and it was just the main three trying to take on the king, D'Artagnan would still side with the king. In the next scene, we meet two of our other main characters. First is Porthos, who represents depression. He's seen bursting through the door, drunk with women on his arms, and just partying it up. But as the film goes on, he drops the facade and comes right out with how he's really feeling. But at one point, Aramis tells him,
I grow tired of this attitude. You're surrounded by beauty, by intrigue, by danger. What more can a man want? Look around you. The robins are singing, the pigeons are cooing. Can't you listen to their song?
Which is a longer, ruder way of saying, why are you depressed? Just cheer up, which, for the record, never ever works.
Why didn't I
I think of that?
And before the final act of the film, Porthos straight tries to hang himself, and he only fails because Aramis knew he would try, and he sawed the rafter beam he knew Porthos would try to use, and then he scolds him for it afterwards.
You've been moping around for months. Maybe now you've got the idea of killing yourself out of your head, you can stop boring everybody and be useful for a change.
Which is just super, super fucked up. Like, I know these guys aren't saints by any means, but regardless of the rigging beforehand, letting your friend try to kill themselves is simply horrible, and there's really no joke to make about that. Speaking of Aramis, he's the next character we chronologically meet, who represents bargaining. The entire plot that they try to carry out in the film is all his idea. It's his way of trying to atone for what they've allowed to happen, and he spends most of the film bargaining and convincing people to go along with various parts of his plan. The hope of, if we can just make this right, we can save the country and ourselves, is him trying to assuage the grief that he's going through. And just as mentioned, he does some horrible things to make it happen, showing us just what grief and pain will do to people. Next, we meet Athos, who represents anger.
Relax, Raul. After all, you're my son. How could any woman resist you?
He spends most of the film letting his anger get the better of him after the death of Raul, which is directly Louis' fault. During the final battle, despite D'Artagnan's request to spare lives if possible, Athos is still just killing dudes. After the first round of fighting is over and they cross swords together before they charge to their presumed deaths in the hallway, everyone's swords are all clean except for Athos, whose sword is just coated in blood. Even when he speaks to Philippe about his reasons for backing his plan, though he seems a little more calm, you can clearly see that it's still eating him up inside. Speaking of Philippe, he's the last of the characters we chronologically meet, and he represents acceptance. He's already mostly accepted his fate when we meet him, and when he's freed, he has an odd, resigned sense to him despite getting a second chance at life. And throughout the entire movie, he's just got this toned down response to a lot of things, save for being put inside the mask briefly. But even with that, he seems to get used to it pretty quickly, which is even hinted at earlier in the film when even after the mask is off, he states that he has to keep it close by or else he can't sleep. And sure, it may not be 100% solid, and maybe they didn't even intend to put this theme in, but enough of the pieces are there that you can easily see where I'm coming from. And past the issue with historically inaccurate films and the suicide scene, I actually really do enjoy this film. Costumes are great, everyone knocks their performances out of the park, and it has one of the sickest burns Leonardo DiCaprio has ever done in a role.
Who's that? Raul, the son of Athos.
Francois, your taste may run to young soldiers, but I was referring to the beauty next to him.
But I'm curious, what do you think?
Musical styles are still a very important form of communication for our young people. Hi.